The sun began to set over the Oregon mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I, a 39-year-old veteran, walked slowly toward the town's animal rescue shelter, my old boots hitting the sidewalk, a constant reminder of the weight carried by each step in my life. Ever since leaving the military 3 years ago, I had been searching for something to fill the emptiness inside me, a void that no job or therapy could seem to heal. Jack, my loyal German Shepherd, once a military working dog who had been with me on dangerous missions, was forced into retirement after being injured, but I had never been able to find any information on his whereabouts. The tiny, modest shelter, with its rusty fences and makeshift doghouses, smelled strongly of disinfectant. Mixed with the scattered barking, the atmosphere was tense yet hopeful. I was there at the urging of my sister, Victoria, who believed that getting another dog might help me cope with the aftermath of war. I was hesitant, but deep down something nudged me forward. As I walked down the narrow aisles, I inspected each cage with a critical eye. Some dogs barked enthusiastically, wagging their tails for attention, while others just stared at me in silence, their eyes full of sadness. None of them had that special spark I associated with Jack. Just as I was about to give up, a rescue worker caught my attention. "Mr. Michael, we have a German Shepherd in the back you might be interested in. He arrived a few weeks ago, but he's a bit special." I looked up in surprise. A German Shepherd? Without a word, I followed the young woman to a more secluded area. In one of the cages, lying in the far corner, was a large dog with black and tan fur. His posture was stiff, and weariness was evident in his eyes. Despite that, my heart pounded. I would recognize this dog anywhere. "Jack," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The German Shepherd slowly lifted his head and looked at me, but there was no emotion in his gaze, no wag of the tail, no attempt to approach, just a blank stare, as if I were just another stranger. "He doesn't recognize me," I murmured, stepping back as my chest tightened, like something inside me had shattered. But then, as I stared at Jack for a few more seconds, something became clear. I couldn't give up on this reunion. Jack and I had a touching story that was just beginning. But what will happen next? Before continuing with the story, please leave a like to support this journey and subscribe so you won't miss the next part. Thank you. I stood motionless in front of the cage, unable to take my eyes off Jack. The once energetic, determined German Shepherd now looked like a shadow of the dog I used to know. The spark that once shone in his eyes was gone, replaced by a distant darkness. Scars on his back leg and one ear served as visible reminders of the battlefield. Yet, there was something else, an invisible wound that I knew all too well, for I carried the same hidden pain within me. The staff member explained in a hushed tone that he was found in a smaller shelter in another state. It appeared someone had abandoned him because they couldn't handle his anxiety. He wasn't quick to trust people. She paused, glancing at me, hesitating before asking if I knew him. I nodded slowly, my voice emerging as little more than a whisper. He was my partner, my best friend. For a moment, I was lost in a wave of memories. Our grueling training, where we learned to trust each other. The perilous missions where Jack saved my life more times than I could count. And the nights when he was the only thing keeping me from breaking down. And now, here we stood face to face, and he didn't know who I was. The staff member carefully opened the cage, and Jack watched but didn't move. I slowly knelt down, extending my hand. "Hey buddy, it's me," I said, my voice trembling but calm. Jack tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand, but he remained tense. My throat tightened. I knew this wouldn't be an easy process. The staff asked if I wanted to spend some time with him. "We could take him to the play yard," she suggested, hoping to ease the tension in the air. I nodded without hesitation. In the yard, the scene wasn't much different. Jack kept his distance, breathing in the open air but avoiding any direct interaction. I watched his every move, trying to read what was going on inside his mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made my decision. I looked at the staff member and spoke resolutely. I'm taking him home. No matter how long it takes, I'm going to bring him back. My voice reflected the loyalty we had once shared. Just like Jack, I needed saving too. And maybe this was the beginning for both of us. The drive home was marked by an unsettling silence. Jack lay in the back of the truck on a blanket I'd spread out for him, staring out the window and avoiding eye contact. From time to time, I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to guess what he might be thinking. It was hard not to feel rejected, but I also knew that as veterans, we both carried burdens that made reaching out difficult. When we arrived, I parked in front of my small house on the outskirts of town. A simple home surrounded by a wide yard and a few swaying trees. I opened the truck door and called Jack. He hesitated, but after a few seconds, he slowly stepped out, each movement careful and deliberate, as though constantly assessing his surroundings. I led Jack to the front door and opened it gently. "Welcome to our new home," I said, trying to sound upbeat, though my voice wavered with uncertainty. Jack walked in, but stopped just inside the entryway, sniffing the air cautiously, as though expecting something unexpected to happen at any moment. Determined to make him comfortable, I had set up a corner in the living room with a new dog bed, food and water bowls, and a few toys I'd picked up on the way back. "This is your spot, Jack," I said, pointing to the corner. But the German Shepherd ignored the invitation and stood where he was. I sighed, feeling frustration begin to weigh on me. As I prepared a quick meal, I couldn't help recalling the days when Jack used to run up to me with boundless energy and unwavering devotion. Now he seemed like an entirely different dog, wounded in a way I understood all too well. Glancing over at Jack, still standing there staring into nothingness, I whispered, "I know how you feel, buddy. I feel it too, lost." That night, I left my bedroom door open, hoping Jack would feel safe enough to come closer. But when I turned off the lights, I heard soft footsteps on the floor. Jack didn't come all the way to me. He lay down near the bedroom door, keeping a safe distance. I smiled to myself in the darkness. It was a small step, but for me, it was the start of something bigger. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gentle footsteps in the hallway. Jack was sitting by the door, ears alert, silently watching me. I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps something familiar was stirring within him. "Good morning, Jack," I said, stretching and forcing a smile. But the German Shepherd simply looked away, retreating to his corner of the room. Determined to rebuild our bond, I spent most of the day trying to engage him. I grabbed a tennis ball and tossed it, but Jack ignored it. I placed a bowl of fresh food beside him, but he only approached it after I left the room. Every attempt at closeness was met by cold silence. I felt the weight of rejection, but I also sensed there was more to it. Fear, mistrust, maybe even pain. That afternoon, I tried a different approach. I pulled out an old military vest I had stored away in a closet. It was the very same vest I wore on missions with Jack, still faintly bearing the smell of sweat and desert sand. Maybe he would remember me. I took the vest to the backyard where Jack was and laid it on the ground, stepping back to give him space. The German Shepherd sniffed the fabric, nostrils flaring as if analyzing the scent. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the emptiness leave his eyes, but then he retreated, tail lowered. I sighed, feeling hope slip away again. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching Jack lying in the backyard, his gaze turned skyward. "I won't give up on you," I said aloud, as though speaking to the wind. "You never gave up on me when I needed you most, and now I won't abandon you." I knew I was asking a lot, but I also knew our bond was still there, even if it was buried beneath layers of trauma. As the air grew colder, I decided to give him space. I went inside, leaving the back door ajar, and went to bed. A few hours later, the soft sound of paws scraping the floor woke me. Looking down at the foot of my bed, I saw Jack lying there, eyes half closed. I said nothing, just smiled in the dark. The gap between us was getting smaller, just a little, but enough to keep me determined. In the days that followed, small breakthroughs began to appear, like cracks in the wall of mistrust separating Jack and me. On Monday morning, as I was chopping wood in the yard, I noticed Jack watching from a distance, his head tilted. His tail was down, but there was a subtle curiosity in his eyes. I paused a moment, wiped the sweat from my brow, and stretched out my hand toward him playfully. "Want to help out?" I joked. Jack didn't approach, but he also didn't look away. Later that same day, on a walk around the yard, I picked up a stick and gently tossed it forward. To my surprise, Jack took a few steps toward it, stopped, then came back to where I stood. I smiled. "So you remember how to play, huh? Maybe you're just pretending you forgot." Though Jack's reaction was still shy, that moment felt like progress. On Tuesday, I decided to take Jack on a short walk outside the yard. I retrieved his old ID tag, cleaned it off, and attached it to a new collar. "Let's go," I said, adjusting the leash. Jack hesitated as I opened the gate, eyeing the outside world as though it was still hostile. I gave a gentle tug, reassuring him, and managed to coax him out. During our walk, he seemed tense, always on high alert, sniffing the air, his posture rigid, as though expecting danger at any moment. I spoke calmly. "We're safe here," fully aware that my words likely meant little, but hoping my steady tone would sink in eventually. As we headed back, something unexpected happened. After I removed the leash, Jack approached and sniffed my hand. I froze, my heart pounding. "That's it, Jack," I whispered, trying not to show too much emotion. I stayed still as Jack continued exploring my scent for a few seconds before pulling away. That small gesture felt like a sign that something within him was changing. That evening, while I was making dinner, Jack lay on the rug near the kitchen. Not exactly an affectionate gesture, but the proximity alone made me feel like we were on the right track. I glanced at him and whispered, "I think we're going to be friends again, Jack." He didn't respond, of course, but his eyes seemed less distant, like maybe he was starting to realize I had once meant something to him. Have you ever felt a special connection with an animal even after being apart for a long time? If so, don't forget to like and comment below. I got up early as usual, only to find Jack already awake, sitting by the living room window, staring outside as though deep in thought. I approached carefully, aware that every interaction with him tested my patience. Recalling something, I asked softly, even though I knew there would be no answer. After breakfast, I decided to bring out something special for the day. A wooden box filled with items I had kept from my service, photographs, letters, small tokens. Among them was an old rubber ball Jack had loved during our breaks. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of memories, and then carried it to the yard where Jack was. I dropped the ball near him. Jack eyed it warily, his body immediately tensing. He sniffed the air like the object held some long-buried scent. For a few seconds, it seemed he would ignore it, but then he moved closer, sniffed the ball, and backed off once more. I stayed silent, watching his internal struggle. By lunchtime, Jack was closer to me, watching everything I did, and for the first time, he accepted food directly from my hand. I could hardly believe it, yet I managed to keep my emotions in check, moving carefully. He ate slowly, never taking his eyes off me, as if he was beginning to trust me once more. That evening, I sat on the porch, rolling the rubber ball in my hands, recalling nights when I would bring this very toy to Jack when I couldn't sleep. I smiled, remembering how determined he was to play, even in our most stressful moments. So stubborn. I tossed the ball lightly across the yard, not expecting much reaction. Jack perked his ears and followed it with his eyes, but like that night long ago, he didn't retrieve it. When Jack settled down near my bed, I felt the distance between us shrink, physically and emotionally. We were both still trapped in our own pain, but now, at least, we were beginning to share some of the burden. Before turning off the light, I looked at Jack and said, "We're almost there, buddy. We're almost there." The next morning arrived with bright sunlight flooding the backyard. Determined to try something new, I decided to revisit a training exercise from our time in the military. With an old whistle around my neck and a lead in my hand, I hoped the familiar sounds might jog Jack's memory, bringing to the surface what lay beneath the trauma and time. "Easy now, Jack," I murmured, stepping into the middle of the yard. He followed me at a cautious distance, eyes locked on my every movement. I blew 2 short blasts on the whistle, our old signal for him to come back to me on missions. Jack froze for a moment, but to my surprise, he slowly lowered himself and sat. "Good boy," I exclaimed, amazement and joy evident in my voice. I then picked up the rubber ball and threw it a bit farther, calling him as I used to, trying to channel the energy of the past. Jack hesitated, staring at the ball, seemingly weighing his options. I held my breath, waiting. Then, after a few seconds, he took a few tentative steps, looked at me, and finally picked the ball up in his mouth. A chill ran down my spine. Jack did it. When he returned, he dropped the ball at my feet and looked up at me. His gaze was something I hadn't seen in years. There was recognition there, a flicker of remembrance in the eyes of the German Shepherd. My own eyes brimmed with tears, but I held them in, not wanting to overwhelm him. That moment marked a breakthrough for the rest of the day. Jack seemed to stay closer, following me around the house and even accepting small gestures of affection. When I sat on the couch, he lay on the floor next to me, something he'd never done before. It wasn't just about the training or the familiar objects anymore. Bit by bit, Jack was letting his guard down and letting me in again. That night, as I sorted through some old belongings, I found a photo of me and Jack on a field, taken the day we finished a tough mission. We both looked exhausted, but had a glimmer of pride in our eyes. I placed the photo on the bedside table and showed it to Jack. We made a great team, didn't we? Jack looked at the picture for a few seconds before curling up next to me, closer than ever since arriving here. Thunder rumbled in the distance, tearing through the gray sky as rain started to pour down around the yard. I watched Jack from the doorway, his nose pointed toward the horizon, mesmerized by the lightning and the drum of the downpour. Holding a cup of coffee, I walked slowly over to him. He turned his head, meeting my gaze. For the first time in weeks, something was different in his eyes. Not the solid wall of mistrust, but a glimmer of curiosity, a small sign that his spirit was changing. My heart pounded. I knew there was still a long road ahead, but moments like this gave me strength to continue. Deciding to seize the moment, I retrieved my old military whistle from the closet, the one I kept with my service mementos. It was a risk, but perhaps the familiar sound could trigger something inside Jack. Returning to the doorway, I blew 2 short blasts, the same pattern I used in the field to call him back to me. Jack whipped his head around, ears alert. For a second, I thought he might run straight to me, like the old days. But instead he took just one hesitant step forward before stopping, the spark in his eyes dimming once more into shadows of doubt. Sighing, I put the whistle away. "It's okay, buddy," I said softly. "We'll go at our own pace." As the rain intensified, I prepared a dry blanket and a fresh bowl of water for Jack. This time, I chose not to push. I sat down on the floor, not too close, simply letting him know I was there. Gradually, he began to relax, lying on the rug and occasionally glancing my way. When night fell, Jack did something unexpected. He slowly approached, his heavy breathing audible in the quiet room. He paused just inches from me. I stayed still, respecting his space. Jack sniffed the air around me, as though gathering his courage for something monumental. Hesitantly, he brushed his nose against my hand, a gentle contact that lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make my heart race. "Jack," I whispered, my voice rough with emotion. I didn't try to pet him, afraid any sudden move would break the fragile moment. After a few seconds, Jack withdrew, leaving me feeling both relieved and hopeful. That simple, fleeting act was a victory in a long battle. Later that night, as the storm raged outside, I saw Jack lying at the foot of my bed, not fully relaxed yet, but less distant than before. That was all I needed. Reassurance that, despite the trauma and pain, our bond was still there, waiting to be rebuilt. By the next morning, the sun shone brightly across the wet grass. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching Jack step carefully through the yard. There was something different about him that day. His movements looked less burdened, and for a brief moment, he seemed less like a traumatized dog and more like the companion I remembered. Determined to keep making progress, I picked up the old whistle once again. It was a gamble, but I knew we had to try. I blew 2 short blasts. Jack's head snapped up instantly, ears standing straight, his body taut with attention. I remained calm, trying not to show any anxiety or push him too hard. "Jack," I said softly, encouraging him. To my amazement, Jack took several steps toward me, his eyes never leaving the whistle. I could feel my throat tighten. He stopped right in front of me, sniffing the air like he was searching for something familiar. Slowly, I picked up the rubber ball again and held it out, then gently tossed it aside. For a moment, he stood still. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Jack ran after it and returned, dropping it at my feet. He gazed up at me in a way I hadn't seen in years. That small gesture meant the world. It confirmed that Jack was starting to push through his own barriers. "That's it, buddy." I knew I was still in there somewhere, I said, my voice thick with emotion. The rest of the day felt almost miraculous. Jack followed me closely, even accepting little signs of affection. When I sat on the couch, he lay on the floor beside me, the first time he'd done that since he arrived. It wasn't just about the training or old objects anymore. It felt like every ounce of patience was finally paying off. Each step Jack took toward me was a victory over the trauma we both carried. That night, for the first time since Jack came home, he lay beside me on the couch, resting his head on my leg. I didn't speak or move. I let the silence speak for itself, the silence of 2 souls reconnecting, trust being rekindled. Gently stroking Jack's head, I knew I would never give up on the friend who had once saved my life. Morning came with birds chirping in the yard, but something even more significant was unfolding indoors. Jack stood in the middle of the room, his eyes on me, as I held his leash in one hand and my old military vest in the other. "Today's a big day," I said, smiling with hope. I had decided to take Jack to a special place, a nearby park we used to visit during our downtime. It would be our final test, a chance to see how far we'd come. On the way there, Jack sat in the back seat of my truck, his head tilted out the open window, taking in the breeze. I caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and felt both pride and relief. For weeks, I'd struggled to bring back the dog who meant the world to me. Now, this moment felt like we'd reached a milestone. "Just like old times, huh?" I asked, not expecting an answer. At the park, I released Jack's leash and pulled out the rubber ball. He scanned the surroundings, but instead of hesitating, sprinted after the ball the second I threw it. We spent hours playing, as though time and trauma had never existed. I could feel the Jack I remembered emerging, yet I also knew we had both changed forever. That didn't mean we couldn't build something new. By late afternoon, the sun was setting. I sat on a park bench, Jack resting by my feet, his head on my lap. I gazed at the horizon, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. "I told you I wouldn't give up," I whispered, running my fingers gently over his fur. For the first time in years, I felt a part of me being made whole. Jack wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of everything that had kept me alive and fighting. That night, as we headed back home, I understood that the future was uncertain, but that we would face it together. Jack, with his unwavering loyalty and courage, had found his way back into my heart, and I into his. I had learned that patience, love, and determination can heal even the deepest wounds. Once again, we were a team, ready to face whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to show your support, and don't forget to subscribe for more moving stories like this. Your presence here truly makes a difference. Thank you.